Welcome to the Progress City Radio Hour. We're here with our latest Town Hall installment. My name is Michael Crawford. With me, as always, Jeff Crawford. Jeff, how are you today?
Fine. How are you?
Pretty good. Sure as you're born. We're here with part 2 of our talk with Scott Girard. Jeff, this has been quite an experience.
Yes, Scott has an amazing career. Definitely recommend people listen to part 1 where he talks about his time at Disneyland and early landscaping days of Walt Disney World through the first decade. Incredible snapshot of somebody who was on the ground and saw a lot.
Absolutely. Knew everybody and saw everything, but that's not all. He also worked on EPCOT Center and Tokyo Disneyland and a lot more. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So without further ado, let's see what Scott has to say.
So in 1978, Epcot Center is announced, and you get sent back to Glendale to work in the WED offices. What was that transition like for you?
Bill had retired. Bill Evans had retired, and I was able to snag him on a retainer so that I had access to that wonderful horticultural encyclopedic brain of his, and so it was going back. I'm a native Southern California, so it was kind of like going home for me.
Mm-hmm.
After having been in Florida for 10 years. Yeah, 9 or 10 years. And, but we were starting up the department anew, fresh, at least in Glendale, because up until that time, all of the investment had been pushed into Florida. So
sure.
I had to hire a staff, and first young fellow I hired was a bright young Cal Poly grad, Terry Palmer. And then I picked up Berge Behasnelian. I don't know if you guys have heard any of these names, but they were the first two and we worked together on Epcot. And 6 months after I got there, we signed the deal with the Japanese, with the Mitsui Land Company. And
yeah.
And I you've probably heard the terms of that deal, right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
And the Disney corporate, made such outlandish requirements that, that over the years, there'd been a lot of companies come to Disney and say, we want you to build a park in our country. And of course, when Walt was around, that was never going to happen. And this looked like just another one of those. And Don Tatum, who was president at the time, or chairman of the board at the time, made these outrageous requirements. And Mitsui Land Company said, okay, when can we talk? And so that was 6 months after we started on Epcot. So, both those parks were designed and developed in tandem, parallel to each other, just 6 months apart, both start and finish. So it was a rather busy 4 years.
Yeah, amazing to me that, Disney then was not the Disney in scope that we know today.
Correct.
For them to take on both of those projects is pretty incredible. Epcot alone was a huge project. It was a real showcase for landscaping, World Showcase. They had all kinds of different climates represented next to each other. How did the Epcot project stand out from what had happened previously?
Well, it completely, different kind of project, in that, WED, everybody at WED, had wrestled with this concept of not so much World Showcase because, that's themed architecture. Disney knows that backwards and forwards. But what was Future World going to be? And how is that going to be represented? And how is it going to be designed? And, at first it was, all these various countries in this crescent that everyone had the same frontage, if you would, like a World's Fair along this walkway. And the only difference would be the depth of the pavilion, and depends on how much money you wanted to spend. And or had to spend and invest and so forth. But in the end, it was basically two theme parks, the equivalent of two theme parks. And one is, Future World, and the other is World Showcase. And it transitions down to the 40-acre lake, and the 1 mile perimeter promenade around the lake and around World Showcase. So you can literally walk around the world.
For the showcase, did you do any overseas travel for research purposes, or was that?
Yeah. No. We did. I did a fair amount. We of course mounted a team that went to Bouchard Gardens in Victoria, Colombia. I went with Ken Anderson. Ken Anderson, Steve Baker, and I went to Africa for 3 weeks.
Oh wow!
Starting in Dakar, across equatorial Africa, Dakar in West Africa, across to Nairobi in Kenya, doing research for the Africa Pavilion. And Card was he was very adamant. He felt that Africa needed to have a presence, but there was just no funding for it. And Ken had designed just a fantastic dinner show for the Africa Pavilion, and it was all based on the heartbeat of Africa. It was called the Heartbeat of Africa, which is music, and the music of Africa, and all of those wonderful native instruments, would be on the walls around the dining room, and the music would come up, and the dancers of the various tribes represented and nations represented in Africa, and just a fantastic show. And well, sadly, it just didn't come to fruition. But we spent three weeks in Africa, traveling across Africa and doing research and whatnot, photo documentation.
That must have been quite an experience.
Yeah, it was. That was my first trip to Africa. I think that was Ken's 5th trip to Africa. It was my first, and subsequent to that, on other projects, I think I've been to Africa like 5 times. So
that pavilion, that Africa Pavilion, is kind of a famous thing, since it was so heavily promoted at the time, and then didn't happen. I just wondered if you tell us a little more about Ken Anderson and that project.
Well, Ken, was his roots with the company, and very, very creative guy. And like I say, he had this show, this dinner show and theater designed, and we had the pavilion designed, and an African, various African horticultural environments, as you arrive and depart the pavilion, and what the pavilion looked like, the landscape looked like out along the promenade. But again, sadly, it just didn't occur.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Mm-hmm.
And Ken was just I would say he was heartbroken, because it was such a good show. Everybody agreed it was, but there just wasn't funding for it.
Right. Another big horticultural element of EPCOT was the land pavilion, of course.
Yes.
In doing research for that, Imagineers toured a number of major botanical gardens. What were those trips like?
Well, we took. I arranged with Card to take the company plane, and we had a couple of researchers from University of Arizona, Tucson, who were consultants to the team. And George Terpazzi was the wed architect on the project, and Colin Campbell came along, and I'm trying to think who else was on the trip. But we visited, I think, 5 major biodomes, controlled environment, growing environment structures around the country. One was the St. Louis biodome, Milwaukee, Mitchell Botanic Garden, Longwood Gardens, Denver. We were out in Denver. So, we were blessed to be able to take the plane, and that allowed us to go and stay and as long as we wanted, and do all of the research in all these different locations, and then just not be burdened with commercial travel. So
sure,
that was fun. we had we'd gone back to British Columbia as well, to Victoria. So it was fun to just have the plane to our access to the company plane, the Mickey Mouse. It was the old G1 turboprop.
That plane has lived so many lives. It's part of so many stories.
It's so true. Yeah, the plane with 9 lives. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, was there anything on those trips that really sort of inspired you that maybe was something you brought back that you used in your work at Epcot?
Well, yeah, sure, all of it. I mean, there's lots of photo documentation, and I would say Jenny Bouchart's garden, Bouchart Garden, Jenny's garden, which is down in that quarry. You guys have probably seen pictures of it.
Yes.
But, yeah, Jenny's garden is a deep, deep quarry, and her husband had been a granite and basalt. He was a miner, and dug all these ugly places, and it just abhorred her to see what was left behind after claiming all this material out of the ground. And so she started hauling dirt down into the bottom and building planters, and the ultimate, it took 30 years or so to build Bouchard Garden, and it continues today. But it's absolutely a magnificent place to be. And I would suggest if either of you have never been there,
no.
It's one of the places that you should go. You could spend a beautiful day there, and just it's stunning, just stunning.
I'd never known that story behind its creation. That's really interesting. And of course, it gets its own small recreation there at Epcot.
Canada. Yes, at Canada. That's exactly what we did. We did some of that research, and of course the mountain, the granite walls and so forth are replicated. The rockwork that covers the Circle Vision Theater and whatnot, and that stream and waterfall. I don't know. Have you guys ever seen how we put those trees up there in that rockwork and all of that?
No, tell us about that.
Well, we put them in tubs, and there was a rockwork skin going to cover the building. It would be a backdrop to the garden there in Canada, and of course, you've got to have trees, and so we designed locations for these tree locations within that rockwork mountain face of the rockwork. So the structural department designed all of the structural framework for these big, giant, they were fiberglass tubes. We initially thought maybe we could use some concrete conduit tubes, but that was too heavy. We landed on some fiberglass tubs that were 3 and 4 or 5 feet across and 4 or 5 feet deep, rather massive in and of themselves. And there are probably 15, 18 trees sprinkled all across the facade of that building. And those tubs were plumbed for drainage, so the plants wouldn't drown, and they were plumbed for irrigation. But you can't see any of this. The guests don't see any of that. It's all behind that scratch coat rockwork. And
well, I would imagine that would have to be maintained to keep the trees within scale over the years.
Yeah, and of course we started, with very, very small trees at the top and somewhat larger trees at the bottom to force that perspective. But yeah, and a few of them have been replaced over time. But yeah, you're right. It takes some maintenance to do that.
I know at one point, prior to opening at Canada, they had installed artificial, I don't know whether they were redwoods, some kind of large trees over there. Those didn't last very long.
No. And that idea was Ahmed Jafari, who was I guess you could say he was the production designer on the pavilion. We had seen those in a museum there in Victoria when we were there on a research trip, and Ahmed just felt, gosh, we got to have these big these big redwoods, and I'm thinking, they just seem so out of scale. I think we had 3 of them on the original plan, and you're right, they didn't last long.
Was it just an aesthetic thing? They didn't work in scale.
They didn't. Yeah, it didn't work. It just didn't work. They just didn't look believable. I mean,
I gotcha. Well, that makes me wonder. I know for EPCOT, a big thing was, it required a lot of artificial trees for inside these attractions. Did the landscaping side, you guys who worked with real plants, did you consult at all on the artificial sort of fake tree farm that they had?
No, we've got a great staff shop. These the guys up in the staff shop, they can do anything. They may make a call and say, what species, what should we use? And they just replicate it. I mean, they didn't help from us for that.
Oh, I gotcha.
But Hank Robitaille, Dr. Robitaille, he was the driving force behind all of the crops that were being grown, the agriculture and horticulture within the land pavilion.
Well, tell me a little more about him, because he's a very prominent name that comes up a lot with the land and was very influential in that.
Well, I haven't seen Hank in a long time, but he really was the driving force for Disney on the Disney side. We brought Hank on, as I recall, to be the company, driving the company bus as far as that's concerned, and he also brought on as a consultant Dr. Carl Hodges from University of Arizona at Tucson, and their agricultural lab, and the big project that Carl Hodges was working on at the time was aquaculture and growing fish, tilapia to begin with, which people hadn't heard a lot of back in the late 70s. But Carl Hodges and his group at Arizona, University of Arizona, had been growing aquaculture, growing these fish to feed, the hungry parts of the world that really don't have a whole lot, because they procreate quickly, they grow quickly, and it's a high protein, and so that's part of what they were doing with that Hank brought them on for the aquaculture part of the show and the story within the land pavilion, and of course, and it included shrimp as well. So it was tilapia and shrimp, and they were growing shrimp in an aquaculture research program down in Puerto Penasco, Mexico, and it was funded, supported financially by the Coca-Cola Corporation, so when you and I haven't been in the show for a long time to know if they're still showing tilapia and shrimp, but that was the go-to aquaculture protein that could be easily grown in controlled conditions and farmed and farm raised and harvested, so it was very, very interesting time to be a part of that. And we had flown down to Puerto Penasco to look at their research facility down there. Puerto Penasco is at the very northern tip of where Baja California meets the main part of Mexico.
Oh, okay.
Sea Cortez, right at the top of the Sea of Cortez. So not far from Tucson. It's across the border. It's, I don't know, maybe 100 miles south of the border.
It's funny you mentioned the tilapia, because that's something that I always, EPCOT was the first place that I ever saw tilapia being raised, obviously. And first I ever heard of it. And so now these days it's everywhere in restaurants, and it always makes me think of EPCOT, because that was the first place you ever saw it.
Yeah. Sometimes, I found myself in restaurants, and I'll say, well, what's your catch of the day? And somebody will say tilapia. Give me a break.
Well, Carl Hodges, who you mentioned, was a big name that was brought in on that. what else did he bring to the table as far as consulting on what you guys were doing?
Well, they it was the whole ag lab, Department of Agriculture there, and they provided a lot of support. Mickey Fontes, Dr. Fontes, with regard to horticulture and growing environments, and their research with regard to weightless growing and hydroponic growing, soilless growing, and you've seen that whole conveyor thing with the plants and the bare roots that are hanging down and through this car wash kind of contraption to that sprays nutrients and moisture onto the bare roots, and of course the spinning drum of lettuce
Yes.
to replicates the weightlessness. So there's a lot of research going on and things like that back then.
Well, it's very interesting that all that, I mean, it made it into the pavilion and was such a, it was in all the publicity, all the promo films they put out would show these things. And so it really was interesting in how EPCOT served to make these things a public facing thing.
Well, and part of the pavilion too is entertainment, kitchen cabaret, and talk. Like Walt used to say, nobody wants to be preached to. They don't want to be educated. Let's entertain them and teach them something. And kitchen cabaret talks about the 4 food groups and protein and how important each food group is one to another and to the human body. And it's just a great fun show, but a lot of good information that gets passed along as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, what was it like working with Raleigh?
Raleigh?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, Raleigh's great. He was great. He was kind of a wild man. He just, he'd been around so long, and he'd been in and out of the company a few times, but he just absolutely one of the most creative guys I've ever run across, if not the most creative. I mean, he viewed the world differently than anybody else I've ever known. And maybe, a little bit, I would describe another person, Walt Paraguay.
Oh, yes.
Walt viewed the world a little differently than everybody else. But again, just a creative genius, supremely talented. The design that he had for the mosaic walls at the Land Pavilion are absolutely stunning.
Yes.
Yeah, but Rowley is, there's a one and only Rowley Crump.
Absolutely. And Walt Paraguay, very much a character in his own right. And that mural, there was so much, the interface between the landscaping and the architectural design over there was, the plantings and landscaping around the land leading up, the way it built into the architecture.
Right.
You guys must have interfaced a whole lot on that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we did with Walt quite a bit. And, when you go back and look at the original photos of not long after the park opened, we had there was a row of oak trees way up slope. And the idea was to knock down the building, the architecture of that building, other than the central crown. And we began shearing those oak canopies into clouds, into big green clouds, that kind of move. Lots of rolls and dips and things like that. And then you just had the trunks fall out of these clouds down to the ground. And then, of course, the overall design of those large, massive spaces on either side of the entryway, just kind of peeled and replicated some of that striated look on the mural, the striations of the Earth's crust. And so, big swaths of bold colors and just a lot of movement, in the landscape.
Absolutely. Well, that leads me to something that I was wondering about. your thought process in designing Future World landscape overall. It's so you kind of mentioned that World Showcase was something that Disney had done before. Future World was something very different from Disneyland or the Magic Kingdom. It's almost a World's Fair. You've got these big buildings. You've got this futuristic theme. What was the thought process in designing that landscape?
Well, we knew if you look at a plan, if you look at an aerial or a plan of World Showcase, you readily see that there's three distinct exterior spaces in that park. One is the central core, the communicore, which is all changing now, apparently.
Yes.
On the west side, what we call West Court, is the Land Pavilion and Imagination, and then later on the Sea Pavilion. And looking at these two large East Court and West Court, we didn't want them to be the same on either side. As we looked at these plans that we were contemplating, and so we began to focus on a curvilinear form for area development, meaning planting space and walkways and water features and things like that on the ground plane. And over on the East Court, where you had that very strict structure for energy, angular structure, later on horizons, and of course World of Motion was circular, which was a nice counterpoint juxtaposition visually to energy in the same large space. We took a more rectilinear direction with the design of the area development. Mm-hmm. So, it would be very, very evident if you could see it on an aerial photograph that we designed the curvilinear spaces, nice curving walkways. We had round circular stacked planters. We called them tiddlywinks, stacked tiddlywinks.
Yeah,
it would stack one over the other partially, and then the waterway that works its way it did used to work its way all the way through from north to south through that side of the court, and then of course just looking at that area as a space, and then on the other side, everything is much more regimented. Even the plantings of trees that are in bosques, and we had a whole 3 or 4 row bosque of eucalyptus that we pruned way tall, almost something you might see as a characterization of some of the trees in Sleeping Beauty. They're just these long, tall poles with just a whiff of foliage at the top, but they were all planted in formal, regimented rows, and so it was just everything over there was more regimented, the hands of man, and the planting and so forth. So 2 different concepts, 2 different spaces. We didn't want the guests to move from east to west and west to east and see the same thing, to get the same sense of space. We wanted it to be a different experience for the guests.
That makes sense. And I can totally see that. On the west side, you have a lot of water with those sort of creek rock, almost rocks at the bottom.
Yes, large river rock, yeah.
River rock. And on the east side, I think of a lot of topiary on the east side are, shaped plants to match horizons, to match energy. That sticks out in my memory, at least.
Yes, that's correct. That's correct. Now, we did have some fun with some plants up, and toward Imagination. We did some weird things up there with some plant materials and trees that we sheared and made, multiple pyramids and, some discs and hockey pucks and things like that. But the real winner in that space, especially the exit garden, because it was just going to be a transitory space where guests leaving the show, the 3D theater, we're just going to walk through that place, and that's out exterior space, and leave the pavilion and go down the ramp, leave the pavilion. And that's when, Mark Fuller and his genius with the laminar flow fountains came into play. And the rest is history. I
Right.
mean, it just energized and vitalized that exit garden.
Yeah, you mentioned this garden at the end of our last episode, and this is one of those things that really sticks out in memory. And when you look at people's vacation photos from that time, this was something that everybody took pictures from in Epcot. It was a really innovative area, but also very whimsical. And I don't know. I would imagine this is one of those areas where you had to work with a bunch of other disciplines on putting this area together.
Oh yeah. I mean, we had designed the planters in a way, that would kind of guide, this theater. At the end of the show, the theater doors open, and the theater belches all these people out into this courtyard area. It's exterior space, and so the idea is not just dump them onto a plain plaza, but we designed the planters so that the guests could flow and follow the planters around, and we really didn't change the configuration of those planters much. That was pretty much done, and Mark and his guys just adapted, how far they were going to throw that slug of water. They could point them anywhere, and so that's what makes it so much fun. Is you just never know. The guests come out of there, and this water's leaping from one planter to another and disappearing, and the next thing you know, it's hopping out again and off in another direction. And I mean, it just hops around the garden, and so it really fun. And that's one of the places, I talked last time we were together about, did I ever go out in the park and just hang out and listen? Well, that's one of the places that I always love to go and just stand around and just watch and listen to guests.
I would imagine, yeah, that would be fun. I also imagine that's an area that had to be heavily, the plantings had to be very guest proofed, because not only do you have this water raining down on everything, but you have people climbing all over everything.
Yeah. It's we had originally planted. I'm trying to think. I think we planted some liriope in there, and that didn't stand the test of time. So we put something a little hardier. I think the last thing I saw that was in there was some dwarf Asian jasmine that will cover up and make a carpet kind of.
Yes.
Very, very tough.
Yeah.
Very tough. But yeah, you can't keep guests out of it. There's no railings that I recall that they had put up on those planters, and so a guest would have to step up into that planter to try to get a face full of water.
Right. Did you have any other favorite areas of landscaping in that park in Epcot?
Yeah, the Japanese garden, I think, was one of my favorites. Of course, the Bouchard Garden at Canada.
That Japanese garden is beautiful.
Yeah, and of course, you have to remember we were designing Tokyo Disneyland at the same time, and so I was commuting between Los Angeles and Orlando and Los Angeles and Tokyo.
Oh wow, yeah.
So for 4 years, I did that for 4 years, and so while I was in Tokyo, I'd take pictures. I'd go to these traditional gardens and I'd take pictures and bring them back, and we'd include traditional details, fencing details or wall details or bamboo screen wall details, things like that. And so a lot of the information in the Japanese garden is information that I brought back from real Japanese gardens in Tokyo and Osaka. While I was in Japan, we were doing working on Tokyo Disneyland. So, and And the China water garden, I think, has turned out to be lovely as well.
Oh, yes,
yeah.
it is.
Yeah.
And that's something that always really shines when they do the flowering garden. They always have some special plantings over there. It looks really nice.
Yeah. Yeah.
Japan, I always think one of my favorite places anywhere in the parks is there at the top. They have the little restaurant up on the hill, and there's a nice water feature up there.
Yes.
And the gardens around that kind of cascade down. That's a wonderful area.
Up at the Katsura. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Lovely spot.
Yeah.
Lovely spot.
Well, there have been a lot of sort of signature plantings in the parks. I think of at Epcot, I think there was that Senegal date palm that was behind Spaceship Earth for so many years.
Yes.
Are there any plantings in particular from Epcot that really stand out in your mind? Sort of distinctive things that you guys did?
Well, that's one of them. I mean, that big monster came. We had to bring it in 2 pieces.
Really?
Wow.
Yeah. We had to cut the root ball in 2 and haul it down the road in 2 pieces. It was too big to haul down the road in 1 piece.
Oh, wow.
That's certainly one. The other was the large, tall Washington palm bouquets that frame Spaceship Earth.
Oh, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And those we collected, and most of them came from around the old Dr. Phillips packing house on Old Winter Garden Road before they realigned it and tore the old packing house down. There were probably a dozen of those there, and we went after them, and we were able to procure them, and then we found a few others. My vision of those 2 bouquets was if you were to be walking along in a field of, say, flowers, that might be up to your waist, walking along, and you reach down and you run your hand right through that bunch of flowers and you pull up a bouquet of posies, just some of these flowers that you just randomly pulled off the plants. Well, what would you have? You'd have some that are taller than others and some that are, because you just grabbed them. And that's kind of how I wanted to compose both of those bouquets. So you see them stepping from the closer to Spaceship Earth, they're a little lower, and then they step higher and higher, and then they step away. So that they're 2 bouquets that, they were never meant to be the same height. They were never meant to be the same exact bouquet, but we wanted them to appear to be similar. And that's always been one of my favorite parts of the landscape as well. It's rather large scale. You can't appreciate them until once you get there and you come through the turnstiles and you're, on the far north end of that entry court between the turnstiles and Spaceship Earth. And then, of course, you can get this magnificent view of the framing of Spaceship Earth ball.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah. That entrance statement of that entire area was always so striking. The beds that they had there and then leading up to those palms. One of my favorite things about the sort of rehabs they've been working on in recent years is bringing back the planting to that area.
I hope they do.
Yeah, because those beds in front of Spaceship Earth were always such an important part of that landscape.
Well, yeah, and we originally on the planters, there's the one large center planter, and then there are the other planters that kind of funneled you underneath Spaceship Earth toward the bouquets of large palms. We had jacaranda trees, flowering purple jacaranda trees. And, they created a rather large umbrella-shaped canopy. And when they were in bloom, I mean, it was a showstopper. I mean, absolutely fantastic. And just incredible. Absolutely incredible.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Was that date palm that you had to move in 2 pieces, was that raised on the tree farm or did you get that somewhere else?
No, it was not raised on the tree farm. We found it, if I recall correctly, we found it in Clearwater.
Oh, wow.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
Yeah, how do you go about finding that kind of stuff? I read there was a mulberry tree too for China that was, I guess, got moved from New Jersey or something like that. Was Tony
Yeah.
Virginia the tree farm guy at this point?
Yeah. Tony found that up in New Jersey, I believe. And it was weeping mulberry. And yeah, it was perfect. It was.
I mean, how does that happen? How do you find something in New Jersey?
Well, you look around and you listen and you have folks that you know in
It's
the
amazing. Yeah.
and who's got weird stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, when you think about something that's supposed to have a lot of character, that's been, like in a Japanese garden that's all twisted out of shape, it's taken 2 centuries to get that to look that way.
Sure.
So what do you do when you're in a nursery that, and again, the nursery industry was better during EPCOT than it was for Walt Disney World, the commercial nursery industry. But there's still lots of nurseries that, they'd have their regular stock, and then they'd have what they call culls, and they just had it just sitting there. And every nursery I went to, I said, "Now, what wouldn't you sell? What do you have that you would never, that you'd never think anybody would be interested in?" And it might be something twisted up, an old live oak that had been blown over and started growing again, and just had a weird shape, and it'd be perfect for Big Thunder.
Yeah.
And the same thing goes with big old junipers, that just get hacked up or split or whatever, and you do a little snip here and a snip there, and pretty soon you've got a really nice focal piece for the Japanese garden, for the Japan Pavilion. And so, I mean, things like that, you just keep your eye out for things like that.
It's got to be so neat for you to see. I mean, maybe it's complicated to see these things mature, over a course. I mean, you think about the trees that surround the parking lot at the TTC, or the oak trees at the back of EPCOT, just growing and growing. And it's really interesting how that affects the space differently over time with a similar landscape design.
There's no question about it. And that even goes for berms, screening berms.
Yeah.
That you start out with the only thing that's screening anything is the dirt.
Right.
Some small trees, and a few years later you've got a temperate forest, and it looks like the banks of the Missouri, and it's pretty great. I mean, that's one of the best parts. And we always kind of talked about it. I know Bill mentioned it to me the first time I'd ever heard it, and I continue to pass it along to the young landscape architects that came on board after me. And that is, the great thing about what we do as landscape architects and as the landscape construction team and the landscape maintenance team is on opening day of a project is the worst we're going to look for what we did,
Yeah.
When you think about a building that's all freshly painted, and the paving and all these things, they age over time. Landscape matures over time, and it only gets better.
That's a great point. I mean, that's one of the most prescient things I think Walt ever said was in one of his quotes or interviews. He's like, the park is going to get more beautiful over the years because the plants are going to grow and the trees are going to grow and everything. And he was right.
He was right. Yep. Yeah. So the engineers, the company in general, learned their lesson about, if you remember me telling you the story about how they dug up the Seven Seas Lagoon and
right,
our gunk on the top, and we ended up having to replace just about every major tree at least once before opening. The company learned their lesson for EPCOT, and they looked around and did some geotechnical studies and found some good buildable dirt and sand just south of the EPCOT site. And they started digging lakes, if you would. They were borrow pits, and imported really good dirt, really good soil for Epcot to be built on and planted in. And that made a huge difference.
I'm sure.
For the project. And now if you look at an aerial, you'll see just to the south and west of Epcot is Caribbean Beach Resort Hotel.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at an aerial, you'll see what look like two long lakes going north and south. They've altered the shapes, the side shapes a little bit, but those were the original borrow pit areas.
That's so funny. I'm glad you brought that up, because when we talked to Bob Holland, he was talking about draining the muck from the lagoon and Epcot and the threat of the muck wave.
Yes.
So it sounds like you guys had not only that, but having to deal with the possibility of sinkhole there. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, there's always that possibility in Central Florida or in Florida. You know, you've got limestone down below grade, and you know the aquifer is down there, and you know you get a shallow ceiling in a limestone cave that loses the water pressure, or the aquifer drops, and you've got a chance of that ceiling caving in, and where does it go? It just keeps siphoning earth, and then you've got a hole open in the ground. Mm-hmm.
So, as you mentioned, at this time, you're not only working on Epcot, but a whole new Castle Park in Tokyo, which sounds kind of simple for some of the design when you're copying the rides, but you were working in a totally different climate and a new culture. How did you set out to tackle this project?
Yeah, it was a different project. First project I've ever worked on that was totally reclaimed. The entire site and the surrounding sites for the future hotels and so forth. They built a huge seawall out into Tokyo Bay, and they pumped sea bottom up into inside the seawall, and brought it up, I think, 8 meters. And then the last 3 meters, they barged of soil, good soil. We didn't want anything to do with the materials that came out of the bottom of Tokyo Bay, but the last three meters were of the entire across the entire site, were barged down the Edo River from the interior part of Honshu, the main island where Tokyo is located.
Oh, wow!
Barged down and then offloaded onto trucks, and then the dump trucks went, just across the way to the site and started dumping dirt. And so there's, we were able to plant in 3 meters of really good soil for that project. But it had been Tokyo Bay at one time. And so it's a totally reclaimed site, first that I've ever done that for.
That's remarkable. Well, and as Jeff said, this is a totally different climate. It's a totally different culture. What challenges did you face going into that?
Well, I would say the first challenge we had was you're doing work in a different country, for one thing, completely different culture. But the company whoever's going to be traveling and relocating to Japan, the company did a really good job of getting you ready. And one of the best books I've ever read on international business was, and I can't remember the author, but the name of the book was it was about doing business in Japan. It was Never Take Yes for an Answer. Because the Japanese don't have a word for no.
Wow.
They won't say no.
Mm-hmm.
But never take yes for an answer, meaning, that you may think that everybody's bought into something, only to find out later, well, we didn't mean that. We know.
Oh, yeah.
So, there was a lot of that, but I would say the first thing we had to overcome was our Japanese counterparts, the fear they had of producing a successful project of this magnitude.
Hmm.
We're talking about, my counterparts. I had three field guys, or two field guys, and a consulting Japanese landscape architect. And of course, Bill was my consultant for horticulture, and they had a consultant, not quite as old as Bill, but he was very well known. And first thing we did is we brought all these guys over to the United States, and we spent a couple days at Disneyland, and then we got on a plane. We brought them on a plane, took them to Florida, and spent a 3 days in Florida. And when they got to Florida, that's when their boots started shaking. They looked, Disneyland was one thing, but when we got to the Magic Kingdom, which the park in Tokyo is basically the same size, scope, they were just so concerned that they weren't going to be able to do that. We're just so concerned, the attention to detail and how beautiful the park is, and technical issues.
Right.
Like Mitsui didn't want to spend any money for an irrigation system.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah. But we sat down, Bill and I, with them before they left for Japan. He and I hadn't even been to Japan yet. And we said, no, it's going to be fine. You guys are going to do great. And we're going to do this together. We're all in this together. And it's going to be great. And you're going to be remembered. You're going to be well known in Japan.
That's got to be kind of flattering to you all, as to, have them be in such awe of your work.
Yeah. Well, it's not just our work, it's hundreds of other people's work.
Of course.
They're looking at, but clearly, yeah. So, that was the first thing we had to overcome, is the fear of failure for them. And so then Bill and I went to Japan, and it was in January, I think. It was in January. It was very, very cold. And, you're right. The cold winter there, the wind comes out of the Siberian plains and down into Japan. And in the summertime, you have the hot, muggy breeze coming up from the south, which Tokyo Disneyland is at the north end of Tokyo Bay. So, it's carrying salt. It's like living next to the beach. You have a little salt on the plant foliar surfaces will burn the plants. And so, we had some real challenges that way. And again, the irrigation, thing, the only commercial irrigation application before Tokyo Disneyland in Japan were golf courses.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
There are no commercial projects, no residential projects ever had any irrigation.
Huh.
They never moved specimen trees the way we do, with the lifting pin method, like we did with Liberty Oak and things like that. They'd never seen that before. What they would do is, for a big tree, might be 2-foot diameter tree, and they'd cut that root ball down to about 3 or 4 feet wide, and then they'd hack the tree back to a hat rack. Looked like a 25-foot hat rack.
Oh no.
They'd haul these, what they called trees, down the road like logs, and that's what they'd plant. Well, then they'd wait 10, 15 years for the tree to leaf out and grow and look like a tree again. Well, we couldn't do that.
Right.
And so we went through the lifting pin method with them, and the landscape contractors over there, the Japanese landscape contractors, they had a joint venture team doing the job. And we showed them how it was done, and they were horrified. They were horrified. And but once we got them adjusted to that, and putting larger root balls on the trees, and leaving, just doing some very judicious snipping for, take a little bit of growth off a tree, and you arrive and you've got a tree, and it'll heal itself. And so, there's some of that. And then we get word, well, the stopgap measure for irrigation is we'll only irrigate the jungle and the around the big river. And They were going to do that with water barges,
Oh gosh.
water tanks and water cannons on barges. Jungle Cruise, Jungle Cruise is more like a float boat, and they'd throw water up on the plants to wash the salt off, and nothing to irrigate the plants per se. And we just finally put our foot down and said, well, and you just might as well not even do this job. It's not going to work. It won't work. And so they finally said, okay. Well, so Walt Disney World, or Tokyo Disneyland, has the first commercial landscape irrigation system installed in Japan.
That's wild. And well, like you said, I had never thought about the fact that it is essentially a seaside resort. And I think about things at the seaside here, and that you go to the beach, there's not a lot of lush foliage and planting and things like that because that sea air. So how did you have to just select for hardier breeds of things, or was it a technology workaround like the irrigation or everything?
Well, no, it was pretty much a selection. I mean, you had to select a material for the climate, and that's number one. The cold hardiness and what would it take. Second was salt tolerance, and so on the south sides of the park, where it would be the first line of defense for against salt. We put salt hardy plants, all along the south side and the berm and so forth, and it gets less the further away from the bay you are, but still you're still under the same threat of salt damage, even way back further north in the park, away from the bay. But yeah, you just have to select your plants based upon what you've been given, climatologically.
Did you have facilities on the ground to help you prepare for the project? I mean, compared to the tree farms you had in Florida, I'm sure it was very different.
Yeah, we had no tree farms. The two joint venture companies had holding areas on their land, and we would, and of course a lot of the material was delivered, like a supply chain just in time. So we made many trips out to tree farms in the countryside, and what they do is they prepare them and it would just arrive. If we needed 2,000 pine trees, and when this was the planting date, well, they would arrive, and all of that strategy and logistics. The joint venture landscape contractors, they took care of all of that.
Oh, okay.
For specific trees and high profile trees, we always looked at them once they were delivered to the holding area, and on offsite. There just wasn't enough room to have a tree farm or any holding area. I mean, the fledgling landscape maintenance crew, they had a couple of greenhouses and a small office building, and that's still what they have.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of what they have at Disneyland. Not much.
Well, any other experiences over there that really stand out for you?
Yeah, a couple of them actually. And
yeah,
one is we were, of course, faced with finding like 5,000 pine trees that could be planted around the Big River, on Tom Sawyer's Island and the Big River, the berms and things. And so on one trip, I'd usually go over for a week or two. And I don't know, a year and a half, 2 years out, when I arrived in Tokyo, my counterparts always had an agenda and a schedule for the time I was going to be there. And this one was to go out and look at the Japanese black pine that they'd found for the Big River and around the screening berms and things. And so we met up at Tokyo Station about 7 a.m. And we got on the train and we went outside Tokyo. We were on the train a couple hours, which you can get out out in the rural area pretty quickly and outside Tokyo. But we arrived, and we were met by a contingent of gentlemen, and I was the only gaijin on that trip, and I didn't even have an interpreter.
Oh wow!
My two counterparts, I knew enough Pidgin Japanese, and they knew enough Pidgin English. And the language of horticulture is Latin. Doesn't matter if it's Japanese or English. The language of horticulture is Latin. And so we arrived, and so they had cars there for us, and we all had this caravan of cars, and we left the little town train station, and we drove for probably 30, 40 minutes, and we were up in the mountains, and on this dirt road, and we got out of the car, and everybody's, kind of yakking, and I'm just looking around at all these trees, these black pines, and I said, so have any of these been tagged? I asked my counterpart, which are ours, and he says, well, these are all ours, 5,000 of them.
Wow.
And I'm looking down the slope, and I'm looking up the slope from the road, and they were great. I mean, they were growing on a slope, which meant that when they were dug, we could plant them with the root ball oriented the way they were grown.
Right.
Oh, sure. Right.
We weren't going to have, that same rocket ship thing that we had Tom Sawyer's Island that built this new world. And so I said, this is great. This is fantastic. 5,000 trees. Perfect. So everybody's laughing and scratching, and we take off and we look at a few other things and decide, yeah, that'll do. So we leave. We go back to Tokyo. Well, about, I don't know, my third or fourth trip later, maybe 9 months later, I see this. We're going back to review the pines, black pines. So we go, same trip, met the same time, took the train out there, met the same group of guys. Up we go to the mountains, and we get out of the car, and I'm thinking, well, this isn't right. I'm looking, and I'm in this like a nursery, upslope, downslope, everything I see, all these black pines had been kind of poodled up, pom-pom style. And I said, I'm looking, and every one of them, and they look like they would be perfect for a Japanese garden, And I leaned over to everybody's, laughing. This is a big deal, big day. And I leaned over to my counterpart. And I said, what is this? What is this? He says, oh, these are ours. I said, we can't use these. And I said, they're supposed to be natural. We can't put Japanese looking trees and he lost the blood ran right out of his face.
Oh no.
Because he had to be the bearer of bad tidings.
Oh.
Okay? And so he leans over to my other counterpart and says something, and he said something to the next guy, and the next guy who said something to the next guy. We're all standing in a circle, and pretty soon the tree farm, the owner of the land, these are his trees, gets to him. Well, he stops laughing right away.
Yeah.
and he's like, he's on the hook for 5,000 trees that nobody wants.
Oh my gosh.
Oh man.
And so it was an uncomfortable few moments, and then my counterpart standing next to me, he stepped up and he told him that not to worry, that the Mitsui Land Company has a lot of projects around Japan, and that those trees will be used.
Well, that's good. Yeah.
And then he asked him, do you have 5,000 more trees that used to look like these? And the guy, he bows his head and, height. So we get in the car and we drive another couple miles, and we get out, and it looks the same. It looked like it did 9 months ago. It's what we were looking for.
That's wild.
And I said, okay, 5,000 trees. I looked at the owner and I said, no touch. Okay?
Right.
No touch. I said, maybe Mitsui will pay you a little more if you promise not to touch him.
Exactly. Well, and you just think of all the effort he must have gone to in.
Oh, every one of those trees had been root pruned, and they had been, what the pruning technique. It's called niwaki, where you kind of bonsai these things up, and into platforms and meatballs and things like that on the branches.
Mm-hmm.
But they certainly wouldn't have filled a bill for anything around the Big River or Tom Sawyer's Island.
It's not very frontier land.
Yeah. So, but I would say it's a little off topic. I mean, it's horticulture, and it occurred at a nursery, tree nursery. One of the only other really powerful experiences for me during that entire project. We had traveled, again by train, and we met up with the owner of a tree nursery, and he had it was a collection. He was like sixth generation nurseryman, and he lived in a 300-year-old thatch roof Japanese home.
Wow!
And his father was there, and his wife and his kids. They all lived together. Multi-generational living is standard in Japan, and so when we arrived, we stepped in. He had a stone-floored office just off the traditional home, and the traditional home. It's hard to explain, but a Japanese home has this short platform that goes all the way around the room or all the way around the house, and the shoji screens open onto this platform, and the platform is called an ungawa. And that's what you sit on to contemplate a garden and so forth. And so when we arrived, again, the Japanese tradition is you arrive and you sit down, and before you do business, you go out to do business. They have tea and they want you to rest from your journey and before you start your business. And so we went into this office, and stone floor and just plain walls and a couple of metal desks and chairs and an old sofa. And I mean, it looked like a nursery in any place in America.
Mm-hmm.
And when we walked in, there was this older gentleman sitting on a pillow on the ongawa in the office, because the office was attached to the house. And he was welcoming everyone. It was the owner of the nursery's father, who had owned the nursery before he'd given it to his son, and his father had given it to him, and his father had given it to him, and so forth. And again, I was the only gaijin on there, and again, no interpreter. And I'm the last one to enter the room, and I'm wearing Western boots and Levi's and a plaid shirt and a down vest and a baseball cap. And I'm 6 feet tall, and with Western boots on, it's probably 6'1", whatever, towering above everybody else. So I duck under the doorway and stand up in this room, and he's welcoming everybody, and I'm the last one in the room, and he looks square at me, and he got up, grabbed his pillow, opened the shoji screen, stepped inside, and slammed the screen shut. And I thought, okay. I was a little embarrassed. I didn't know what to do. I hadn't said anything. And so everybody was a little unsettled by it. But we finished the tea and we went out and we bought a number of really lovely, beautiful specimen materials for various parts of the park. So we came back, and again, the business tradition is you have some tea and you refresh from your being out in the field and doing business before you go on your journey to return home. So we go back into the same space, and the older gentleman is there again. Same space, sitting on the same pillow, and he doesn't say anything. And we're sitting there and doing all the final paperwork and so forth. And there was a lull in the conversation. Finally, he started to speak very low in Japanese. And everybody, of course, shut up, because that, elders are premium in Japan. You just don't You don't talk over them. You don't talk, back to them. They're very highly respected in Japanese culture. So all of these men sitting around this room, they were listening to him, and they were, nodding their head and so forth. And I didn't know what was going on, what he was saying. And finally, he stops talking, and he looks directly at me. My counterpart leans over to me, and he said, Mr. Morita would like to know if you would shake his hand. I said, sure, I'll be glad to do that. So I got up, took my hat off, bowed to him, and I held my hand out to shake his hand. Now, this is very odd because Japanese don't touch one another. They don't shake hands. But he said he wanted to shake my hand like an American. Well, he didn't. He grabbed my hand and he took it, and he held my hand in his two hands, and he looked at the palm of my hand, he looked at the back of my hand, turned my hand over, and then he put his hand in mine like a handshake, and we just kind of shook hands. And I went and sat down, and I didn't think anything about it. And so when we left, a few minutes later, we all went back to the train station, said goodbye, and we got on the train. On the train, we're riding along, and I asked my counterpart, and I said, what was that all about? And he said, Mr. Morita, since the end of the war, has hated Americans. He said he remembers the day that the emperor was on the radio and told the Japanese people that, they were surrendering, that the Americans had won. And he'd hated Americans the rest of his life. And he said he'd never seen an American up close in his entire lifetime. And he said he knew he was getting old, and he didn't want to carry that hatred any longer.
Wow.
He said he figured you were the only American he was ever going to see in his lifetime before he dies, and he wanted to make peace.
That's
right
incredible. There. Wow.
And I'll tell you what, guys, the hair stood up on the back of my neck.
Sure.
No kidding.
And so that's probably the most impactful experience of my project life with Tokyo Disneyland.
I would imagine so. Well, that's something I've wondered about the Tokyo project happening when it did, when so many of the elder members of the team on both the American and the Japanese side would have come from that generation.
Correct. And
I just wondered if I've always wondered if that ever sort of colored the discussion in any way. I mean, knowing how, our grandfather talked about those times, I just wondered if any of the people on either side of that deal had, feelings about it one way or another.
Well, I never heard anything from the Japanese side. I know that Card was uncomfortable with it. He had been a flight deck officer on an aircraft carrier during the war. But, nothing overt. There was never any discussion about it. I do know that younger generations, of Japanese that I knew there, got to become acquainted with, became friends with. I never heard a word about it. If anything was ever said, there was a very high regard amongst my generation, the generation that came after the greatest generation that fought those wars. The greatest admiration that I would hear is about Douglas MacArthur, saved Japan from being pulled apart. Russia wanted the northern islands and China wanted the southern islands, and Douglas MacArthur said, no, this is going to remain a nation, one nation. You're not going to pull this archipelago apart. And so there's a pretty high regard for Douglas MacArthur by, Japanese people that, that know history, post-war Japan history.
This is such a fascinating period to be in that cultural dynamic. And in that, you were the first if I'm not mistaken, non-Japanese individual elected to the Institute of Landscape Architects in Japan.
Japanese, yeah, the JILA, yeah.
Yeah. Now, what was that like?
Well, I never went to any meetings.
So pretty good.
But my counterpart, Yamamoto-san, Norihisa Yamamoto, was my landscape architect counterpart on the project, and he had his own little practice. They were consulting landscape architects to the Mitsui Land Company, and he nominated me and sent me a fax or something and said, "Congratulations, you're now been elected a member of the Japanese Institute of Landscape Architects." I have a certificate here someplace. I don't know.
That's cool. So that I'm all told that must have been a pretty impactful project.
Yeah, it was fun, and the Japanese, they're crazy about Disney. Even before the park was open, I mean, Japanese are just nuts about Disney and Disney characters and things, and we contracted with a nurseryman. Again, outside Tokyo, but not very far, smaller town outside Tokyo, to grow all the topiaries for us.
Mm.
And we used, real topiary, we sent the drawings for the armatures, for the animals, the dancing hippos and elephants and camels and things. We sent the drawings for the rebar armatures and to Japan, and they fabricated those and put them in big boxes and grew the topiary just like we'd grown them for Walt Disney World originally. And this nurseryman, he lived in this little town there, and he found kids were coming, on the way to and from school. They were detouring in through his nursery so they could go look at the topiary. And he was disturbed by that. And I went to inspect the growth process one time, and he was telling my counterpart that he just can't keep kids out, and I said, "Well, are they doing any damage?" And he said, "No." He said, "They just want to, they want to bring their friends and show them all this." And I told him, I said, "Well, my advice is have them bring their parents. Let their parents see it. And tell them it's for Tokyo Disneyland. CDs in Tokyo Disneyland. So make sure that they take you to Tokyo Disneyland."
Exactly.
Brilliant. So you get Tokyo open, and then not long after, there's a change in leadership in the company. They get started on Paris, and you leave the company.
Correct.
I read a blurb where you said at the time, there was a change in financial attitude. Sometimes it seems that we could never make enough money. It was a time of big cultural change at the Walt Disney Company. A lot of veterans leaving, kind of rubbing them the wrong way. I wonder if you could speak to that a bit.
Well, it was just a time that, that it seemed that the culture was changing. And I was at a point where, I was involved in the very early planning stage of Paris, and, Marty, I went to Marty and, I said, "Gosh, Marty, I'm just thinking that maybe there's something else I ought to be doing." And he looked at me and he said, "Look," he said, "we're just getting this thing in Paris up and going. And, it's an opportunity, it's just a project of a lifetime." And I looked at him, I said, "Marty," I said, "I think I've had a couple of projects." And so, that's the way it was. And so, yeah, I left the company and did some consulting with them occasionally, with different projects. And so, yep.
Yeah, it was definitely a big cultural shift at that time where, priorities kind of shifted. The feel of the company seemed to change. But yeah, you went and worked all over the place. Some of the projects I heard about that we're interested in were the U.S. Olympic sites, this Ameriflora exhibition. How were those experiences?
Well, they're big mass attendance events, and the work on the Atlanta Olympics was very interesting, and as was Ameriflora '92, in Columbus, Ohio, and it was the first international flower and garden expo in the United States, and they'd been doing these in Europe every 4 years since the end of the war. They had they whoever the host city was would have an old bombed out rail yard or whatever, and they'd have this flower and garden festival and turn it into a park and leave it for the city, the host city, and they'd have a new park. And so Mariflora 92 in Columbus, Ohio was already, the site selection was already a beautiful 88-acre park, a 100-year-old park with a 100-year-old conservatory, crystal stone and glass conservatory. And we tripled the size of that conservatory and did a lot of upgrades to the park and new waterways and waterfalls. And I think it was about a $120 million project, which was a lot of money back then. It's
wow, yes.
But
yeah, reading about that, it sounded like such an amazing, like there were just so many different areas of different kinds of plantings, and it sounded really cool.
Yeah, 6-month show, and there were international gardens, and there were corporate gardens, and various exhibits and entertainment, and Barbara Bush was our patron, and she brought the president and to open the event with her, and Bob Hope was there, and it was quite a big deal. Quite a big deal. 6-month event, April to October, and it was, and the park that was left behind, all of the assets, the expanded conservatory and so forth, is, we're all still in operation, and the park's still beautiful.
Oh, that's great.
So the year of the Olympics, you return as general manager of Disney's horticulture program. So what brought you back? And the organization was switching around at this time. Can you speak to what changed and how you were involved in that?
Well, yeah, it was a time when they were looking to consolidate some things operationally, and they were DDC had been created, Disney Development Company.
Sure.
They were, delivering projects, primarily resort projects. They didn't do any work inside the berm and any of the theme parks, but they were delivering resort projects, and there always seemed to be, angst, if you will, surrounding the project delivery and cost cutting that had been done through value engineering and the design and construction phases. And so Walt Disney World, being the end user, is saying, well, maybe we ought to look at how we have these projects delivered, and could we do it in a more seamless way instead of, you've got these silos, whether it's DDC or WDI or WED or whatever, they have these projects and hand them over, throw them over the wall to the construction company who builds it, and then they throw it over the wall to the end user, the operating side of the business, and rather than have everybody at the table at the same time throughout the process. So that began to change, and that's when Bud Dare called me and said, "Hey, it looks like we're going to be changing some things around here, and you've been on the design and construction side, and we think you'd be a big asset here on the operating side because you've been through it and how it all works." And so I said, "Sure, why not?" And so the first thing we were going to do was there were 4 separate operating businesses within the resort division. There were the horticulture groups were basically resorts and parks, theme parks. And the theme parks, of course, were the Magic Kingdom and Studio and EPCOT and so forth and so on. And the resort work was all Lake Buena Vista and all the different resort hotels and properties and golf courses and all those kind of things. And over on the resort side, it was split down even more, where they had 4 separate divisions or departments within that division. And so my first charge, Bud gave me the first charge, was to consolidate those 4 business operating units into one resort division, which I did, and took about, I don't know, 9 months to a year to get it done. So we became, could skate a bit faster, and cleaner operations, better delivery of services, maintenance services, good cost savings. We eliminated some duplication just because of structure. And about a year and a half later, Bud and Al Weiss came and said, well, we think we want you to work with Katie Warner over and did parks, and we want to put it into one division, one big division, one division. And so we did. And that took about a year and a half, I guess, about a year and a half to do that. And so it all became one big maintenance. It's Disney's Horticulture now. And first thing we did is we took leadership, supervision, leadership personnel, and began to move them around, take some of the parks people and put them over in the resorts, and resorts people in parks, and, just to start cross-pollinizing,
Sure.
staff and crew and whatnot. So
it's interesting to me that they were separate in the first place. I don't know, was it that different an environment working in resorts than in working on parks?
Well, it didn't used to be. When we opened the park, the Magic Kingdom, and there was the Contemporary and the Polynesian. Tony Virginia was the maintenance manager then, and he had all of that. And as the resorts grew, they basically just split off. As a business unit, I don't know the decision, but they became almost larger than the parks division as far as personnel, labor, and equipment, and so forth. So
yeah, I imagine to you coming back, they had started a course of just aggressive development down there with tons of hotels, and they'd done celebration as well. Was your crew involved in any land use discussions or identifying kind of resources on property as part of this?
For celebration or for growth?
Just at the property wide.
Well, we always tried to have a seat at the table when there was anything going to be talked about as far as development's concerned. I'm not saying I can't sit here and say it always happened.
Right.
Because lots of meetings occur, and sometimes you just don't even know about it.
Mm-hmm.
Always like to have be present when something like that's being discussed. It turns out to be a better project, I've always found, anyway.
Well, the resort, it as Jeff said, it had this exponential growth. So rather than how, was there a difference in the way Disney planned and maintained the landscape of the resort due to all this growth?
I don't think so. I think that for example, I think one of the first new projects that was built was, the Grand Floridian, and I think that was opened in '88 or something like that. And then of course you went to the moderate priced hotels, Caribbean Beach and Port Orleans, Dixie Landings, all these different product types and sports and whatnot. They were viewed as individual projects, and they were, staffing requirements were planned, and equipment requirements were planned. Everything, was planned that way. But then as we began looking at consolidating these, after we began looking at cross-utilization of equipment, and do we really need, that many gang mowers? Can we, can we cross-utilize this equipment, and same with labor?
Mm-hmm.
So, but it to that degree, we always took a look at the most efficient way to get the job done and maintain the quality. You had to maintain the quality.
Well, that's what I was wondering. I mean, I would assume as the resort grew larger, it would become more difficult to maintain the quality just from, allocation of resources.
Well, it's the leadership, as far as show quality assurance and show quality standards. There's a lot of folks that looked at that.
Mm-hmm.
Me, but even the line managers, that tiered up to me, and the assistant managers and the supervisors and assistant supervisors. No, the quality is always number one. And, if there's always a challenge, it's always a push and pull, with what you need versus, what the company's going to allow. And, Jimmy Carter started back in '76 with zero-based budgeting. And so we went to that whole idea within horticulture of basically zero-based budgeting. If, we knew the labor, what labor was required for, 100 feet of edging and X number of acres of mowing, so many thousands of bedding plants and pruning, different types of pruning, whether it's shearing or nipping or just touching once a year, fertilization, all those labor costs, material costs. And what we began doing was building that budget from the ground up for each and every resort and park ultimately. And so when we'd go to budget reviews with corporate or with, senior management there in Walt Disney World, there was no fluff in the budget, and if they didn't like the number, well, and they didn't like the number, then you're not going to get what it's going to take to do the job. So it took there's no politics in that, and nobody, it was up to them, you can say yes, you can say no.
Right.
So, but we had all the background data that we know.
So Animal Kingdom opens during your tenure in this role, and a very different view you probably had of that project than the other park projects. It's kind of a park where landscaping takes on an even bigger role, it seems.
Oh, no question about it.
How was it set apart from a landscaping planning perspective as compared to the others?
Well, I mean, like you just said, I mean, it is the leading role of any park I think we've ever done. And Paul Comstock did a great job over there. And Dennis Higbee, was driving the maintenance, and they worked very closely together. Of course, and then you've also got a crew of people growing browse material for the live critters.
Right.
Right. I mean, it's not just you need eucalyptus for the koalas and, giraffe and, things like that. And, what are you going to do? You're not going to go to a eucalyptus farm. You have to grow it. So, yeah, it's a very interesting project. It was a great project for me. I got to stand aside and watch.
Right. Yeah.
But they did an absolutely fantastic job. And even the follow-on additions, Expedition Everest and things. I mean, just magnificent.
It's really stunning. Now that browse kind of that took over where the tree farm was, and some of the park did as well, right?
Yes.
I guess with the nurseries growing up, you didn't need those resources as much as you used to. Is that
correct?
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. You can go to Cherry Lake or down to Manny Diaz down in Miami, or whatever you need. You need 200 palm trees, date palms, and you want them all to look alike. He's got them. You just say, "I'll take that 100, thank you."
Different world, yeah. So you leave Disney again in 2000, and how has your experience at Disney shaped you so far, even after you worked there?
Well, it clearly, my involvement in projects and it shapes your thinking. It shapes the way you look at projects. It shapes the way you can help clients view and see things that maybe they don't even think about on projects. And I'm thinking about end use. And my work now is primarily in the senior living arena. I'm working on projects in communities, life care communities, where it's a large campus, or it's a project that is multi-generational. We prefer not to work in a behind the gate kind of 55 and over kind of community. We really like to work it wherever possible with multi-generational aspects where the campus is open, or very near elementary schools and shopping areas and things like that. But my view of project work overall and what can be. I mean, we designed a memory care garden for dementia and Alzheimer's, memory care garden down on a project in Fort Myers. And we designed in some rain chains and that, fall into copper buckets that make noises, make sounds. It becomes a sound garden during the rain.
Oh, wow.
And pop jet fountains, that we use like in the Imagination
Oh, yeah.
at EPCOT, pop jet fountains. And of course, these gardens are designed so that there's no standing water ever. And they're multisensorial, butterfly gardens, so there's some little bit of wildlife in the garden. And they're designed so that, there's no elopement opportunities where guests want to get agitated and want to escape out of the garden. And they're designed in a manner so that it's easy. There's a nice flow. There's a walking pattern that can be repeated, over and over again, and so forth. And I mean, we even spec, sport deck, that rubberized sport deck material.
Sure. Yeah.
For the walkways, which is stable for people to walk on and wheelchairs to roll on and walkers and so forth. But we've already, in our projects, I mean, we've been contacted a number of times about the number of bones that have been saved, from being broken when a resident would take a tumble on that. So, those are all things that you kind of bring to the table, and what you want to introduce and work with.
That makes me think of another question I had, which is, this is kind of like the tilapia question, but
Yeah.
I feel like, we as kids would be introduced to a lot of concepts, as landscaping as well. But to me, it's through Disney, but to me, it seemed like Disney influenced a lot of landscape design in the latter half of the 20th century to now outside the berm. Do you find that as well?
Oh, absolutely. Sure. And that's when you think about it in those terms, you think about restaurants, Rainforest Cafe. What are they doing? They're creating an environment,
Right.
It doesn't matter retail, your retail experience. It's, entertainment and entertainment components and theme components. You're finding it, throughout industry, all kinds of industry. So, the senior environment isn't any different, quite frankly. I'm older than many of the residents on projects that I'm working on. And they're not the same seniors. They're not my dad's senior or, anything, your dad's seniors. They're just, everyone's arriving in retirement now with a much different expectation of what they want in their retirement years. I mean, they're coming with theming demands. They're coming with dining option demands. They're coming with recreational environment demands, and they're just, and they also come with a sense of many of them want to give back to the world. through volunteerism and so forth, and to stay active and whatnot. So it's it's different than that old behind the ivy wall rest
Right.
kind of thing.
Yeah, I worked at one of these places. I don't know, it was about a decade ago, but I worked as a server, and I couldn't believe. I mean, these people were more active than I was in my life. They were always doing stuff, and like you said, volunteering. They were taking in concerts, everything. It's incredible. To imagine their needs are multifaceted for sure.
Yeah, and it's just these changes have really just come about in the last decade or decade and a half, and the curve continues to grow in that regard. And that we have a number of our clients are older facilities, that where the rooms are not grouped in a neighborhood that share a living room. They're the hallway with rooms off of a hallway and a nurse's station at the end. And, they're just grim.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the way they were building them. And, I call it warehousing, senior warehousing.
Mm-hmm.
You're just warehousing these people. And somebody goes into a room and plays the piano, at 2:00 every day. And those kinds of facilities are either dying and closing, or they are investing heavily in new environmental growth, which most often includes the connection to the outdoors. And biophilic design there's tons and tons of research on biophilic design and how important nature is and the connection with nature, with humans. And, that's part of our design as well is, how do the residents relate to nature, and the arrival sequence. And, you only have one chance. And usually someone who's deciding to move into a senior living environment, a campus or life stage or continuing care, they're not the one making the decisions.
Mm-hmm.
The kids are making the decisions, the daughter or the son and the daughter of the future resident. And so what's really important is how your facility is represented from the arrival sequence and to the front door, and from the front door through into the facility. And what are your views out to nature from inside the facility, and how well connected are the residents and the staff to nature? And it's becoming more and more important in that arena.
What's interesting to me is how, talking about how much this circles back to Disney being ahead of the curve. What you're talking about sounds exactly what in the 70s they were talking about for Lake Buena Vista, what the aspirations were then for living there. It's much the same thing. They were really ahead of the curve on that.
Yeah, I think so. And the whole notion that you could live and work, there and and have one, like the EPCOT, the old EPCOT model,
Mm-hmm.
But then once you have residents, then you have voters, and and that doesn't fly with a corporate mission. And but you're right. Lake Buena Vista did provide. It was going to be the so-called residential or resort community to Walt Disney World, and with retail and food and beverage and lodging and all those kinds of things. And of course, early on, the multimodal station, with train and Stollport and whatnot.
Well, as you look back, because we've run through a lot of it with you, this doesn't have to be inside of Disney. What are some projects that you are most proud of?
I think Ameriflora was one outside of Disney. I think within Disney, EPCOT, just stands out. And also Tokyo, because Tokyo was our first international park. Mm-hmm. Outside the U.S. just so many. It's hard to put my finger on just one.
Yeah. Well, what is it about Epcot that stands out in your mind of being the biggest achievement of that?
I think it was, the ability to pull off a project twice the size of the Magic Kingdom on one site with such a diverse design palette from Future World to World Showcase, and within World Showcase, such a diverse international theming palette. And, just the chance to work with so many wonderful, fantastic people. I mean, engineers, architects, technicians. I mean, just incredible folks. Just fantastic.
That's wonderful.
All of my colleagues at WDI, I mean, WED even, we still stay in contact. There's Facebook groups and whatnot. And, just people that I got to know even back at Disneyland in 1964, I'm still friends with, and we have these life experiences, whether working at Disneyland, driving a monorail, or conductor on a steam train, or loading people in a Matterhorn sled. When you do these things, or you build a park together, you design a park, or you build a park, everybody goes through the same experiences, and you have those shared experiences, and nothing needs to be explained when you're together.
Absolutely. Well, and you see that in the way these groups remain tight. It seems like they're always having, especially I feel that Epcot Tokyo era team, always having reunions, always, having events. And I think just going through that experience together really builds a bond. Sure.
You're absolutely right. And I know the WDI alumni group, they had to stop because of COVID, but, for a long time, and I think they're starting it up again, either later this month or maybe September, or maybe October. I'm not sure. I guess the Delta variant's going to determine it, but
sure.
A monthly lunch where everybody gets together. The old WED WDI, alumni, which I was able to attend one a couple years ago.
Oh, that's great.
My wife and I were out on the West Coast for a wedding, and it just happened to occur a few days after the lunch, so we went early, and it was great to catch up with a lot of folks.
Oh, it's a lot of fun. Well, you've mentioned a little bit about what you're up to today. We always like to give folks we interview a chance to plug what they're doing now. Are there any projects you'd like our listeners to know about?
Right this minute, there's nothing I can talk about.
That is sometimes the case. I understand.
Yeah, we've got a number of projects on the burner, and again, they're in senior living, but senior living environments or arena, and it's become a very competitive market, and so it's not uncommon for us to have to sign a confidentiality agreement on things we're doing. So
understood, but keeping very busy.
Yeah. We're very busy, and it's hard to believe. I'll little shameless plug here. I'll be 75 in October.
There we go. That's the kind of plug we need.
I just I can't believe it. Who'd have imagined? But anyway.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing all this with us. It's been really interesting.
Great. Well, I appreciate it, guys. Both you guys are great interviewers. You toss out some questions, and boy, that just brought back memories. And
well, thanks. Well, anytime you think of anything, because I guarantee you, between Jeff and I, there are about probably 50 pages of questions we could probably think up as, this stuff is so fascinating. And, It's we talked about this in the last episode, such a fundamental element of Disney parks. And, our parents are both really hardcore home gardeners. And, when you grow up with that eye for these things in the parks, it's such a fundamental element of it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're right. You're absolutely right, Mark.
Brings a lot of joy to a lot of people. So thank you so much for everything you've done, and thanks for joining us.
Good to be with you.
So that wraps up our second part of our Scott Girard interview. Michael, I could have talked to Scott for 4 more hours, and maybe we'll have to have him back at some time.
I know. If Scott is willing, I have a feeling he's going to be a regular visitor if he's at all willing, because so many stones left to turn over there.
That's right. Always good to talk about EPCOT. We haven't talked as much about EPCOT yet, but we will at some point. But
it's going to happen. I know.
Yes. So Michael, what's coming next on the radio hour next month?
Next month, we're visiting one of our favorite areas in the Vacation Kingdom. Earlier in this year, we talked a little about the delights of the Seven Seas Lagoon. This time we're heading into Bay Lake, which has a number of opportunities of its own for fun and frolic. And so we're going to take a look at some of the history, some of the fun of Bay Lake.
Yeah, Bay Lake is my favorite place, probably, if I had to pick one. At Walt Disney World, sitting there, at Fort Wilderness, going out on Bay Lake. Doesn't get much better than that. So we're looking forward to discussing that through a couple of different lenses.
Yeah.
And Michael, this is the time where we check in and see if there are any new Patreon subscribers.
We do have a new member of our Patreon society. We'd like to welcome April, who joined up. Thank you for your support. In addition to helping us produce these episodes and do all that we do, you're also getting early access to episodes, maybe some other extra behind-the-scenes content. And at the silver level, of course, we have our monthly live stream. So thank you very much for joining up. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, we appreciate all of you who have signed up. Some of you got some goodies in the mail recently. So
yeah,
it's exciting stuff. If you're interested in finding out more about that, you can check it out at patreon.com/ProgressCityUSA. And thanks again to those who have already contributed. You can reach out to us at podcast@ProgressCityUSA.com. We love to hear your thoughts about our episodes. Any suggestions for the future are also welcome. You can also be in touch with us on Twitter. Michael is at ProgressCityUSA. I'm at Jeff G. Crawford. And now Instagram at ProgressCityUSA. So lots of ways to check us out, or talk to us, or what have you. Give us feedback. You could also give us feedback on, your podcast platform, the iTunes store. Rate and review, all that good stuff. Any of it is welcome. We love to hear from you. So with all that said, we look forward to seeing you out there on a pontoon boat on Bay Lake, right in the middle of Bay Lake, USA, next month. Thanks for listening. Take care.